Welcome, everybody. My name is Jess Delfiaco. I am the Communications Manager for the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. Just as we get started here, a couple of housekeeping notes. We are recording this seminar. It's going to be shared out afterwards to all registrants over email. It'll also be available on our YouTube channel. So to that end, if you want to keep your cameras or your microphones muted, please, while Lucia is presenting, and choose whether you'd like to have your videos on or off. You are welcome to put questions into the chat throughout today's presentation. We are going to have some dedicated Q&A time at the end, where you'll also be invited to go off mute and ask your question directly if you'd like. I think that's it for logistics. Many of you, if you want to go back, Sarah, the previous slide. Thanks. Many of you are familiar with the Midwest CASC, but we get quite a few new faces in each of these seminars every month. So briefly going to talk a little bit about who we are and what we do. The Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, or the CASC, as we refer to it, is a partnership between the U.S. Geological Survey and a consortium of institutions throughout the region, hosted by the University of Minnesota Twin Cities, which is where I'm based. And our mission is to produce science to help fish, wildlife, water, land, and people in the Midwest adapt to a changing climate. We accomplish that mission in several different ways. So just to briefly kind of hit on a few different aspects of our work, we conduct synthesis research on topics relevant to regional priorities. There are currently 6 synthesis research projects hosted at these different universities on the map here. Each led by a postdoctoral researcher. Related to that, we support a network of postdoctoral fellows and graduate students who are pursuing adaptation research. We work with one of our consortium member institutions, the College of Menominee Nation, to host a tribal undergraduate research program each summer. In addition to that, we host other professional development opportunities, capacity building workshops, and events for our community. And of course, the USGS through the CASC funds climate adaptation research, and we work to support those projects and those partnerships. So with that, now we can go to the next slide, Sarah. I'm excited to turn things over to today's speaker. Lucia Fitts is a GIS research associate with the Global Forest Watch. She formerly was a postdoctoral associate at the University of Minnesota here. Her work focuses on helping improve land use change and reduce the climate footprint of commodity supply chains. And today she's going to be talking about the state of adaptation planting in the upper Midwest and the Great Lakes region. So Lucia, we can hand things over to you and you can pull up your slides. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Jess. Give me a second to share my screen. And hopefully you can see the slides properly.
Yep, they look good.
Perfect. Well, thanks everybody for joining today, and I'm excited to be talking about this work since it's been a nice passion of mine to work on this for the last few years. This was a project that I did as my postdoctoral associate position at the University of Minnesota, and this project was funded by the Midwest CASC. And the paper for this work was recently at the beginning of the year, released in the Journal of Forestry. This is why the title of the presentation is slightly different than what we showed, but this is actually the title of the paper. So I'll make sure to send the copy of the paper to Jess for her to distribute to everybody so if you want to access more details of what we talk about today, you can find them in the paper. Some of the tables and figures from the paper are gonna I'll show you during the presentation today, but I also wanted to take a second to thank all my co-authors presented in the slide today who were part of the paper and the work itself. And with that, let's move to the next slide. If I can make this, there you go. So this is actually just want to show the heading of the paper for the Journal of Forestry. The DOI is there as well if you want to access it. But yeah, let's move on to the next one to get things started. So as many of you might be familiar with, forest habitats across the upper Lake States region are threatened by the impacts of an increasing frequency and severity of climate extremes and disturbances. as well as an increasing prevalence of non-native insects and diseases. These threats have contributed to significant areas of tree decline and mortality, as we can see in some of the pictures here, altering forest habitat and conditions. In addition to that, we know that global change is expected to have profound impacts on forested ecosystem, challenging how forests are managed now and into the future. These threats can be in the shape of climate change, including increasing in temperatures, drought, and novel disturbances from different pests and pathogens, as the classic emerald ash borer that we see in this slide, which was a big focus of this paper as well. So all of these create challenges in the classic or business as usual type of management, and that's why all these adaptation strategies are starting to pick up here. And yeah, given the significant cultural, ecological, and economic impacts of this forest loss in the region, there is, as I was starting to say, an urgent need for adaptation strategies. This adaptation strategies can be in the shape of assisted migration, ash underplanting, range expansion, resilience strategies, etc. I do want to pause in the ash underplanting term for a second, since I'll be mentioning this a couple times during the presentation. So what do we mean by ash underplanting? It's pretty much planting of non-ash species in ash ecosystems. So whenever emerald ash borer comes through and kills the ash in the canopy, the different species will have established to help preserve the forest and the structure of the forest and the services that the trees can provide in this ecosystem. Another thing I wanted to point out for this presentation is that tree planting for adaptation can take many forms, but the focus for today and for this paper was planting species or genotypes that may be better suited for future climate and associated disturbances, and invasive species, specifically emerald ash borer. So whenever I talk about adaptation plantings in this presentation, I'm referring to either for climate change or for emerald ash borer adaptation. So with that, the purpose of this paper, we focus on assessing how adaptation plantings are being practiced by forest stewards in different organizations. And this is what every time you hear me talking about state of the practice, this is what I'm meaning. Pretty much what are people doing in the region? And then for that, we had two specific objectives. The first one, to explore the characteristics, levels of implementation, and current state of the practice of adaptation plantings among the different stakeholders. You'll see in the next couple of slides, our study population was varied across different organizations, institutions, and academic institutions as well. The second specific objective for this work was to understand the institutional support, policies, and guidelines for adaptation plantings among the different organizations, since as you might see throughout the presentation, they're very different. Our study area, we focus on the Great Lakes region of the US, which is composed by Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and the native nations that share the geography with the states. You can see in orange there, and you'll see better in the next slide too, that we had specific projects that we visited just to understand what the projects were, what species were planted, and like what are people doing themselves, and those are the ones pointed in the map. And why we focus on this region? Mostly because given its unique location, it's actually located in a transition between boreal and temperate forests. So it is important for both, it's an important region for both climate change and invasive species, and it has a big potential for adaptation plantings to address these threats. The slide is the same map as before, but this time the dots are colored. So again, the dots are the projects that we visited, and each of the colors, as you can see in the legend, apologies a little bit cut in the top, but the legend should be still identifiable, but the different symbols and colors identify who manages each of the projects. So as you can see, most of the projects that we visited were managed by either Minnesota or Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, but we also had some projects either federally managed, or the orange points there, for example, are from the Nature Conservancy. Then the triangles are from county offices, and we also were able to visit a couple of Fond du Lac managed projects, which are the ones in purple. To get the information that we're presenting here now, we did different different study techniques. So we did 47 informational interviews These interviews were done with the goal of understanding how adaptation planting was pursued among organizations. It was a semi-structured interview, so some of the questions we had them pre-written, and some of them, depending on how the conversation would evolve, we will deviate from our script just to make sure we got the most out of the conversation. We also did in-depth surveys, so we were able to get 27 responses of those. Those surveys had the goal of understanding the current or future project location, if somebody had a project on the ground. If so, what was the planting year, the project objectives, what species they had planted, if they had a monitoring plan, etc. So like more project oriented, just to try and understand the diversity of the projects that we were identifying in our interviews. The next technique that you can see in the slide we did focus groups. So we were able to do 3 focus groups with 17 participants in total. And we asked them different types of questions, but in general, we're trying to get an understanding of the general background and experience that these people had with adaptation plantings. We were also asking questions about the institutional trends and policies for adaptation plantings, opportunities and challenges that they saw, and similar themes like that. You'll get in the paper, in the supplementary material, we actually have there all the questions that we asked in each of the techniques. And finally, we also reviewed almost 50 different documents that we were provided between different guidelines, different policies, strategic plans, vulnerability assessments, internal project reports, etc. So it depended on what people had available. So as we started talking to some of these managers, they said, oh, we have a policy that might be of interest, or we have a guideline, or we have a vulnerability assessment. So we reviewed all of these documents to get a general idea of what was happening in the region. From the right side of the slide 2, you can see that's table 1 from the paper if you wanted to get back to it too. But this is how our population is categorized if we divide it by geographies and institution. So as you can see, we had a mix of participants from different institutions that were able to be a part of the study. And only because I've gotten this question several times, I want to show this figure that's also from the paper, meaning how our population was distributed among these techniques. So we did have people that participated in more than one. So there were some people that participated in a focus group, survey, and interview. Some of them were only interested or were available to participate in a focus group or an interview. So that just shows the spread of the population and who participated in what. All right, let's move on to the results section. So some of the themes that we saw in general, the biggest takeaway for me is that adaptation planting efforts were mostly exploratory rather than operational in scope. As we were talking to the different agencies and people who participated, we noticed that agencies have different politics, different constraints, different capacities, level of comfort, and budgets. So if we were even within the same institution, and I'm going to put the Department of Natural Resources from Minnesota as an example, different departments within the DNR had different budgets, had different constraint and policy that would determine their ability to participate or create adaptation planting projects. For example, the forestry department had more budget and ability to conduct adaptation plantings than other departments, like for example, the Parks and Recreation Department, who was more limited into their budget. But as you will see later in this presentation, they actually were able to put together a couple of adaptation planting programs or projects. And one of them that we'll see later is the Nurstrand Big Woods State Park. And then another point that manager highlighted is that they have little experience with implementing these adaptation plantings. So a lot of what we see so far is from their own experience, their own level of comfort, and how much they can or are willing to risk if things don't work out, like if the species don't survive or we have high mortality, so how much they can risk it. That's kind of how it was determined of if they were able to or willing to implement this kind of projects. Let's look at more of the themes. The first one, and this is good news, adaptation was seen as a priority. So we heard that adaptation and mitigation, including adaptation plantings, are currently priorities across all sectors. There was more funding available in the recent years for available projects with an adaptation component. on the different funders that we heard from, the people that we interviewed were, well, the point that we made the interviews in 2022, 2023 was Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, Wildlife Conservation Society, Climate Adaptation Fund, State Department of Natural Resources also funded some projects. The Minnesota Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund was another source that was highlighted, and at that time, the Forest Service as well. The next theme that we saw is that current efforts are exploratory. So I started to touch on this point a little bit. So despite the growing prioritization, adaptation plantings is not a routine practice in the region. Most of the adaptation plantings up to date have been largely exploratory efforts rather than an operational tool that to adapt and sustain our vulnerable forests. The next theme that we notice, perception of effectiveness. So there has been a variable success among the adaptation planting projects we surveyed. Some interviewees noted that they had good survival and growth rates. Others mentioned no, we had high mortality. But the definition of success was dependent and varied among the projects and organizations, and also a little bit subjective depending on who we were talking to. Different factors that would affect the success of the projects that we heard were soil conditions, hydrology, microtopography, competing vegetation, and like resource availability. Like if there was a lot of competition within species, or if there was like an open canopy, that also affected the success of the projects there as well. And also important note as well, by the time we made those interviews, the projects were very young. They had been planted 2 or 3 years ago, or some of them had like a year still on the ground. So they were very new. We have a second paper that we're working on now that we're revisiting some of these projects to see how they're doing a couple years later. So the story might change a little bit, but this is what we heard at the time that we made those interviews. The next theme was, oops, moving this too fast. Adaptation to emerald ash borer. So plantings to address the loss of ash from emerald ash borer are common across the region. Climate change is exacerbating this threat, as we all know. Warming winters lead to greater overwinter survival of the larvae from emerald ash borer, so it increases the spread of non-colonized areas. So the underplanting that I was mentioning, so planting of non-ash species in the understory prior to the infestation of emerald ash borer were the most common type of projects that we found, with the main objective to establish a new tree canopy and tree species that would maintain some of the aspects of these wetlands, just mostly maintain the hydrological functions that the ash serves right now. Then if you start looking at different institutions, the tribal nations or native nations and the Department of Natural Resources from Minnesota and Wisconsin had several on-the-ground projects, but most of them in small areas. Like we had areas of like 1 to 10 hectares were the most common sizes of the adaptation planting projects we saw. Michigan had a different focus. When we did those interviews, they did not have, like Michigan Department of Natural Resources, just to be specific, they didn't have on-the-ground projects that we could go visit yet, but they were building their research capacity, and like they were hiring more professors at universities to be able to focus on these topics. So they were like building their capacity to be able to do adaptation planting projects later on. We did see that all Department of Natural Resources are increasing their effort to build collaborations and develop staff capacity with climate adaptation experts, which is great news. Like we saw that trend across our interviews. And well, these experts are expected to help develop these on-the-ground projects and attract funding to support these projects. What else? We also saw that there were a lot of provenance tests across the region, but because that was not the focus of our paper, we only recorded the provenance tests, but didn't really go further into them. But in the region, there are projects focused on tree improvement and orchards, just trying to see the different genotypes and what's more adapted to different conditions. Also, I want to highlight the partnership within institutions. So there exists some partnership between institutions, but we heard that more collaboration is needed. As you might expect, if your neighbor is doing an adaptation planting project, planting, let's say, swamp white oak or bur oak or other species and you hear they're successful, you're more likely to try the same thing than if you're starting from scratch saying that your risk increases, even if it's a perception risk, if you know your neighbor is succeeding versus just starting from scratch. So just those collaborations might encourage more people to start trying those adaptation planting projects. Let's move into what the Nature Conservancy was doing. From the NGOs, the Nature Conservancy was the one that we heard the most from, and also the one that we saw had the most influence in forest management in the region, forest management for adaptation at least. Even if the Nature Conservancy does not really own a lot of forests themselves, they actually pursue these adaptation projects in partnership with other institutions. For example, we visited one in Split Rock Lighthouse State Park that was managed by or started by the Nature Conservancy, but also the land is owned by the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. So we saw that collaboration that the Nature Conservancy was doing projects on DNR lands. And that helps make larger projects more operational. And also the Nature Conservancy has less policy constraints than the DNR, so it helped promote some of these projects. So for the Nature Conservancy specifically, we saw on-the-ground adaptation planting projects in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And we visited the one in Minnesota and Michigan. Most of them were installed between 2021 and 2022. And then the sizes will range, some of them as small as 1 hectare. But for example, the Split Rock one had more than 200 hectares in size. So we're talking about larger projects from the Nature Conservancy compared to the others that we saw from the DNRs. Just to provide some examples of the species planted, we saw they had eastern white pine, northern white cedar, white spruce, red pine, northern red oak, jack pine, and bur oak. At the time we conducted the interviews, the Superior National Forest also had small plantings, but they also wanted to do more programmatic plantings in the future and include adaptation plantings into their planning. So we saw a movement from the Superior National Forest towards the more adaptation trend. And then for private landowners, these are a different group, of course, but they own more than 50% of our forests here in this region, so they're an important group to consider. These private landowners actually were a little more experimental, since they're not constrained by the politics that, for example, the DNRs are or the Forest Service, so they can actually try different things. So despite they having few policy constraints, which is a good thing, it can also backfire on you because there's not as many controls as like in an institution like the DNR on like quality of the seed sourcing, or if you're introducing a new species that you shouldn't be introducing, etc. So we have that double-edged sword there. But with one thing I wanted to point out from this slide is if you look at the medium to the left image, that little bald cypress tree was actually one of the species that the Wisconsin private landowners were planting. At least I spoke to 2 that did that, and I've heard from them that more people are starting to replicate planting bald cypress. And this was a surprise to me because some of you might know that bald cypress is like a large. It actually is not native to this region. Their native range is southern Illinois and Indiana, so it's a very long distance movement of species. But because it does very well in swamps, it was actually doing pretty good in their projects in Black Ash in Wisconsin. This photo was taken in 2023, I think. But I recently spoke to the private landowner just to check on, hey, how are your bald cypress doing out of curiosity? And he said they were doing pretty well, that they've grown a lot since we spoke last, and they were doing pretty well. So we see like random things like that people are starting to experiment there. Okay, let's look at some of the adaptation planting projects more specifically. This figure also is from the paper, but it's a heat map that shows results from the surveys. This on the x-axis, you have the different geographies, and on the y-axis, the different project goals that the participants were saying that their project was classified as. So you can see the darker the color, the more responses we had into the specific category. both in most of the, we had more participants from Minnesota, so that's most likely why there's more darker colors in there. But the trends kind of stay similar. Some of the most common goals were assisted population migration, assisted population expansion, reforestation with the goal of species diversity. So we start seeing those common trends across the states. And some more general adaptation planting projects across the three states and the native nations that share this geography. They have different objectives, different scales, and different management strategies. Most focus on climate adaptation of black ash wetlands, and they use a mix of either local or non-local seed sources. There were some deer protection measures that we saw, and because browsing was a very common problem that we heard from them. And some of those deer browsing measures that we saw were like the tubes or the mesh that they put in some seedlings. Not in the majority though, but because they're very expensive. But we did see some managers trying that. Um, a little more details on the project goals. Apart from what we see on the graph, they include diversifying black ash wetlands in anticipation to the mortality from emerald ash borer. Another goal was to maintain a consistent functions in forest health in the face of these threats, either climate change or black ash or emerald ash borer, and also managing for a diversity of species and age classes. Here we can see some pictures that I want to show just for you to get a picture of or an idea of the diversity of the projects. On the left, and I'll get back to this project later in the presentation because it's one of the ones I like to highlight, is Nerstrand Big Woods State Park. It was planted in 2019. See how the open canopy from the diaph looks like there? Because it used to be a full canopy cover from like big woods, big oaks, big maples that dominated the canopy until, I don't want to give away too much before we get to that slide, but and just there were some threats that created that mortality. So that's where the Department of Natural Resources started implementing this project. The middle one on the top, we have Snake Creek. This is a little bit different. We were focused on plantings, not on seedings, but this one actually caught my attention because it was a very small project. I think it was 1.5 hectares total, but they tried in different strips, different seed sources. So they had in one strip seed sources from southern Minnesota, then northern Iowa, and the central part of Iowa. So like it's over the years, it'll be nice to compare how the seedlings are doing based on the seed source. Because everything else is relatively the same. Of course, there's different microsite ecological differences within any site, but I think it was the closest we could get to having the different seed sources in one small area with the same species planted. So that was interesting from Snake Creek. On the bottom, we have the private landowner that I was mentioning from Bald Cypress. He was actually using tubes to for the storm white oak and mesh, I believe, for the Bald Cypress, just cover it from the deer browse. But you can see even from the pictures the variety of the projects that there's in the region. The two on the right are from Nature Conservancy. The top one was from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and the bottom one was the Split Rock that I was mentioning. So there's different, as you can see from the pictures, the canopy are different. Some of them are planted in gaps. The fish camp one on the top right was actually planted. It was not harvested, it was just planted on the understory. So there's differences within there as well. Let's look at more pictures here. So some of these projects or other type of project we saw was the one on the left, top left, the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, ash underplanting from the Wisconsin DNR. This was actually 10 different sites that they planted the same species, like tamarack, like swamp white oak, hackberry, and others, to try and see how they were doing in different sites. So, and this was still very young. It was a 1-year-old project or a 2-year-old project when we went to measure, but I'm curious to see how species are doing over the years. The one in the middle I wanted to highlight too, because that's from Fond du Lac Band, and they were doing something that I haven't seen in other projects. So this one was a black ash and planting. So because it's a wetland, they have this because it is a wetland, there's like it's very, very wet on the site, so it affects tree mortality, especially if you're testing new things. So they were creating little mounds, so like pretty much putting more soil into a mound, and they'll plant the seedlings on top of the mounds to give it a little bit more of an advantage to establish before like it gets affected by the over like the anaerobic conduction from the water, etc. But that was something unique that I saw in this project that I haven't seen in other places. Yeah, let's move on to the next slide. So this table is from the paper. I don't want to get into the details on that now, but you can see also as another way of showing the different projects that we looked at, and also from the surveys what managers were communicating. So in the first column we have who was managing the project, then we have the location, the project goal, area planted year, etc. So you can, if you're a manager and you want to replicate something like that, you can get an idea of what people are trying here. The seed sources were there as well. The seed sources was hard to trace back because a lot of people don't really know where it came from, but we at least could get to, is it local or is it not local? So that's what we reflected in the column here. And just because I know you were probably wondering what species were planted in each of the projects, I want to show these tables as well. So for the ash under planting projects, the most common species were swamp white oak, northern white cedar, and silver maple. From the climate adaptation ones, we had a slightly different combination of species, but some of them were the same between both. So we had the most common one being red oak, black walnut, and bur oak. In total, we saw like about 24 species among the projects that we visited. And yeah, most of the projects were either climate change or ash adaptation, as I was mentioning before. All right, let's go back to a more general picture. I want to point out some challenges that we heard from the people we interviewed. Um, the first one is the lack of policy and guidance, and we heard that a lot. So some of the uncertainty about doing or not doing an adaptation planting project comes from the lack of specific guidance and formal policies. There's also not like a best practice guidance on when or where to plant species, what type of species, what type of genotype. So that is not very well established formally, at least yet. There's still much uncertainty on like which approaches to include, what seed sources are successful when planting the different types of species and why. So that's not established either. Most organizations in the region have little to no experience in planting in forest wetlands, so that was a big challenge. And those are common in the region and the main ecosystem for where black ash is right now. Another important challenge was the misalignment, and this was also emphasized a lot during our interviews, the misalignment between seedlings needed for adaptation plantings and what nurseries are currently able to produce. So you can see where that mismatch is going to be problematic if you want to do an operational scale adaptation planting project. So specifically, there was a lag between the species, genotypes, and stock types and quantities that nurseries are growing right now versus what the managers would need if let's say I'm a manager, I work for the DNR, I want to create a project in a specific location in Minnesota. I will need XYZ species from let's say the Iowa sourcing seed source, etc. If I go to the nursery, they're not necessarily growing that. And for me to ask that, it'll take the nursery a couple of years for them to catch up. So there's a mismatch there that is going to be problematic if we want to operationalize adaptation plantings. And yeah, other logistics were challenges as well, and you can read more about that in the paper too. Let's look at a more positive side now. What are some of the opportunities here? So, as I was mentioning during the presentation, adaptation and mitigation are current priorities, which is good. There's more availability of funding in the recent years as well. This one, I think I cannot highlight enough how important it is, learning through regional collaboration. If like there's some like seminars like these, or there's other like site visits, or there's like opportunities for people from the different institutions to connect and see, okay, what are you doing? what is the other person doing? What species are you planting? How is it working? That's super important to start spreading and increasing adaptation plantings across the region. And then regarding the challenge that we saw before about, and when I was talking about the nurseries, it was mostly the state nurseries that they have that problem. Private nurseries have more independence, so they're probably not as big as the state ones, but they can actually do different things. So there's an opportunity there to work with private nurseries to try and merge that gap between what the nurseries are producing and what managers need for this kind of projects. Okay, let's see if the video plays. Yes, it does. So remember Nordstrom Big Woods State Park that I was mentioning? I want you to focus on both the seedlings that are in tubes and also look at the canopy change, how it goes from a very fully covered canopy to a wide open. This site was not harvested. It's just the die-off of how the canopy is open. So backing up a little bit, Nordstrom Big Woods State Park is located in Rice County. So it's about an hour south from Twin Cities. If you haven't gone to that park, it's very close and it's very pretty. Even like now with fall colors, it's very pretty. So it's administered by the Minnesota DNR, as I was mentioning, from the Park and Recreation department there. What happened here, I'm gonna play it again while I talk so you have something else to see while I talk. But in 2016, approximately, the DNR started observing these large die-off areas on the southern side of the park mostly. And they were trying to investigate what was going on and why this massive die-off was occurring. And what they found was that precipitation over the last few years had been increasing. So there was more anaerobic conditions created in the park. So this is a different challenge that we usually hear with climate change. We usually hear that there's going to be a lot of droughts, fewer or like less water available, etc. This was the opposite. There was more precipitation, creating anaerobic conditions and creating these massive die-offs. So let's move to the next slide if I can. Okay, just to see what the park is doing. So in this map here, you can see in the red sections, the red sections is actually all the die-off. So you can see how much of the park was actually affected. And I hope you can see it on the screen, but there's 4 different yellow rectangles there. So those 4 different plots, I think they've put a couple more since that time we visited. We're trying to get updated data from Nordstrom for a newest paper too to update some of these numbers. But up to 2022, 2023, when we were summarizing these results, they had 4 plots that they were trying to do adaptation projects on. And this one is an interesting one. It's a sad one, but I do like, it's my favorite to highlight because it has a 2-part problem. First one, climate change, was talking about like how the amount, like increased amount of water was creating all these die-offs. And guess what's coming back as a regeneration? Just to make things more complicated, ash is coming back as a regeneration. So you can see how once these ash trees that are growing will like become like larger, they'll be affected by emerald ash borer, and then what will remain in the canopy is uncertain. So it has climate change and emerald ash borer problem in there. So that makes this project very important and hopefully an example for others to try and replicate. So these plantings, they planted like different species, including what you can see on the right. This survival survey is actually data from the DNR. So they planted cottonwood, silver maple, swamp white oak, hackberry, and elm. The elm was a Dutch elm disease resistant variety from the University of Minnesota that was provided to the DNR for them to plant that. And yeah, and they did put, as you saw in the video, some tubings or mesh in the different seedlings to protect them from deer browse. And yeah, I'll have this one more slide for results, and then we'll move into take home messages. But this project was interesting as well because they tagged every single tree. So it had an ID. So when I went there to measure, I actually had an initial measurement from them, from the DNR, and my measurement here. And I think they did another one after I was there as well, and I'm trying to get the data from. So we actually have growth data for this project that we don't have for others, for the individual trees at least. So you can see in the two graphs side by side, on on the left side, we have the difference in diameter at base. So because these are small seedlings, might be saplings by now, but at that time they were smaller. So we didn't measure diameter breast height, but we measured at the base. So the left side is a difference in the base, and you have the different species there. And on the right is a difference in height. And as you can see, cottonwood is the one that was doing the best at that time, followed by elm, silver maple, swanbite oak, and hackberry, which was growing the few or the least, but it was still there. So like from all the species, the cottonwood was the one growing the fastest, followed by the elm, but they were all doing okay in general. All right, let's get back to the take-home messages. You might be wondering what's successful from all what we've seen here, and it's hard to say because you need to know your site ahead of time to determine what species to plant and like the different ecological differences in order to see what to plant in your site and what can be successful. Like, again, I cannot emphasize this enough. Collaboration across agencies and institutions is key to be able to scale up adaptation plantings and share that expertise and experience of what's successful. This might sound obvious, but yeah, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Just plant the diversity of species, see how things are evolving. And yeah, so like if one doesn't do good, you have the others there to complement and compensate. There is an important need to build a whole framework for operationalizing these adaptation plantings, because just to answer the question, how do I move forward? As I was mentioning, there's not really the formal policies that will help you answer this question. How do I do an adaptation planting project if I'm a manager and want to start one? And yeah, I was talking about disconnect between adaptation ideas and nursery capacity, so hopefully that can be solved. And scale matters for determining success. Like the projects you've heard me talk about today are mostly small in size. There's a couple of exceptions like the Nature Conservancy, which is a little larger, but scale matters for determining success. This small projects might be successful, but if you put it into a larger scale project, it might not, under the same conditions even, it might not be the same. So that's important to highlight. Scale matters for determining success as well. And with that, just want to acknowledge one more time that the funding for this project comes from the Midwest CASC. And I wanted to thank again our team, our co-authors team, and all the collaborators. As you might see all of these responses and you saw all the tables with the participants, we had a lot of different institutions help us provide answers and different perspectives. So thank you all so much for making this project possible. And also keep an eye out for the next paper that we're working on. Hoping to get it out early next year. So that will be the part 2 of this project when we're actually diving more into the seedling data, because we actually went to the projects and we measured diameter height for all our samples. So that data wasn't exploited or used in the first paper, but is being used in the second paper. And with that, I'll turn it back to Jess and open the floor for questions.
Thank you, Lucia. You're welcome to drop questions in the chat and I'll help moderate, or unmute yourself and you can ask yourself.
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me? Great.
Yes,
I've got a question, please. You referenced revisiting these projects a few times over the course of your presentation. What's your sense of the average length of time for an adaptation planting project? And is there a typical timeline for evaluation or longer term monitoring built in?
Yeah, so this project wasn't during my postdoc, so now like I've moved on from these, but we want to complete the second paper, so that's why we're talking to the managers from these projects to see what has happened since my last visit. So most of these projects have been implemented, and you can see that in the paper there's a table showing the year of planting, but most of these are pretty new. From 2020, 2021 planting years, or 2022. So it's still very young for like managers to actually say, okay, this was successful, this was not successful. There were a couple of exceptions. Some projects were like 10 years old or something like that. You'll see a different survival rate for sure. but most of the projects were brand new. So like that's why I was hoping to transmit that like the success is a subjective metric for this paper right now is like what we heard from the managers. From the documents that I reviewed, I did not see any formal policy of like you need to measure these projects at year XYZ to be able to call it successful. So I haven't seen that when I reviewed all the documents that I received. So I'm not sure if things have changed since then, or if like specific agencies might have different regulations too. But most of these projects, they had their survival surveys conducted at year 1, 2, 5, and then to be determined later. But yeah, I haven't seen a formal protocol saying you need to measure in this years to be able to know what's happening. And that's something that probably should be done.
Awesome. Thank you, Lucia. We have a question in the chat for you from Jackson. What from your study and work with the various participating organizations were the most common barriers to effective implementation of adaptation planting projects for natural resource managers on the ground on a larger scale?
Yeah, that's a good one. So it varies for sure by institution, but I think the politics of it has a lot to do. Like there are specific policies from the different DNRs and Forest Service of what they can plant, what species they can plant, and also the goals for the projects. So most of these projects are focused, like the general projects are mostly focused on like production of timber or any other goals like that. They can diversify a little bit and start trying different, like a diversity of species. But if they want to try something entirely new, they couldn't really get away from those politics. So that was like they constrained them a lot into what they can actually do. So like the projects that we've seen is mostly a manager from a specific organization saying, oh, I have this land, I don't know what to do. It's a small land. It doesn't matter if I fail, I can try this, see how it works. So that's kind of what we've seen so far. So and that environment was starting to change. Like we saw some new policies starting to be developed at least at the Minnesota DNR. I think that Wisconsin had a couple ones too. So I think in a couple of years we might see those changes in the policy that will allow them to deviate a little bit more from the norm and just trying to experiment different species and different strategies like that. And then budget was also something like that for a constraint because they might have budget for a classic planting project, but if they want to try something new that might fail, they might not be able to risk that big of a budget if things don't work the way they should. And at this point, it was a lot of experimentation. So I think that was the biggest constraint that I heard from people.
Awesome. Okay, we have another question from the chat from Alexis. How does someone get involved in this project? My organization doesn't own land, but I work with private landowners and land management organizations. If I were to pitch this program to my partners, who would I put them in contact with first?
Right. So I think like some of the co-authors in this paper are actually good people to maintain there. Like I've moved on from the University of Minnesota. I'm working on different things now at the World Resources Institute. But for example, like Tony D'Amato is like still active in this kind of projects and can help contact. So like if they send me an email, I can help put them in contact with the different co-authors of the publication. And like we're hoping that with the paper, and this is one of my personal goals for the paper, helps as an inspiration, and you can actually see the institutions doing what. So you can actually get an idea of who to contact, one institution to contact because of you want to replicate what they're doing or something similar. So we try to create that network that will help expand that. So yeah, like you can send me an email later and I can help contact with the co-authors, or if you can see them in the paper and you recognize them, feel free to reach out directly too.
Great. Another question from the chat from Jennifer. Could you expand your research to include local or county park districts who also conduct lots of planting projects?
Yeah, that's like totally doable too. And I forgot to mention these, like our sample was based in whoever we were able to contact and who was available at the time. We tried to reach out to the different organizations, but of course there's people that we missed. So yeah, like if I was to do this again, like if like those smaller landowners were part of it or interested, they'd for sure be welcome to that. And I'm hoping that some of my co-authors are continuing this work as well in order to expand on this work. So yeah, it's totally doable to do. Just, yeah, as I mentioned, I moved on from this project, so I'm not responsible for it anymore, but I know that a lot of my co-authors are still doing this type of research.
Wonderful. So folks can feel free to drop their questions in the chat, or you're also welcome to raise your hand, unmute yourself to ask the question on your own. I have a question myself, Lucia. I was wondering if you're aware of any programs in Canada that are working to get species from northern states in the US or from northern Minnesota specifically, if they have climate adaptation programs in place.
That's a good question. And I wish I knew the answer, but no, we didn't get to Canada, so I don't know how it works over there. I think at some point during our email outreach, I heard from somebody from Canada and the Forest Service doing, or their equivalent of their Forest Service doing something like that, but I didn't really follow up since our focus was the Great Lakes, so I didn't do much. I know, like, this is not Canada, but also it just reminded me that my co-author Peter, who's in this paper too, had another publication with more states, a more general approach, but included more states on all the eastern side of the U.S. So that might be something else. I can send an email later to you, Sarah or Jess, pointing out to that paper too, if you want to share that along. But both of us were doing this service kind of in parallel and complementary to each other, so that has a little more broader perspective. I dove more deeper into the Great Lakes, more details there, but that might help broaden the scope of the project too.
Great, thank you.
We don't have any more questions in the chat, but if folks want to raise their hand or ask one, we've still got a couple minutes, so I invite you to do that. Give you a few seconds before we move to our closing. Seth.
Thanks for the presentation. I guess I was kind of surprised when you mentioned that there's a lot of ambiguity surrounding like how the most appropriate species to engage in replantings are, how to do it, and all that sort of thing. Is that, I guess, maybe to rephrase here, are we at a point with kind of replanting projects where there's enough data to kind of really nail down what's driving survival, like how to decide on which species are appropriate where in which habitats, or is it still too nascent to kind of really come up with a good answer to help guide, or what's kind of the state of best management practices and species selection in kind of that broad context? So I guess, sorry for the poor question here, but I'm curious about the factors that are driving survival, and is the primary impediment to being successful in this space really the absence of knowledge surrounding just knowing what will work where, or is it really just the absence of collating that into a set of best management practices to help people make decisions in their space?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both, but also when I said that people don't know what to plant where, it's like focused on adaptation specifically. There's a lot of research, like to show what species are like better for specific ecosystems on current environment and like on like business as usual type of plantations. But like this movement to adaptation plantings and just looking into the future, expecting like what's gonna be better or not, that's kind of like where the ambiguity still remains. There are some efforts though on their way. Forget the full name of this resource, but there's the University of Minnesota Extension created a list of adaptive species, like species that are expected to be adapted for the future, that they recommend for private landowners. So there's resources starting to come out. I know there are NIACs, also the forget the acronym right now, of course. NIACs from the Forest Service is creating this adaptation workbook, which it's a whole framework and a course too, like my managers can take in order to guide them through what's better or like what would work for their situation. Let's think of like climate adaptation, how would that change or not? And I did take that course just to help me understand how that perspective would work into this project. So I just did a scenario just to go through the whole adaptation workbook, and it's a really good resource to like for managers to go through. So you can actually put, okay, this is my project, this would be my objectives. Next phase would be, okay, let's think about the climate change. How would that impact? Will that make you change your species or strategy? So there's some resources and trainings that are starting to happen. I haven't really seen a formal policy at a state level or federal level saying, okay, this is what managers should use for this situation. So thank you, Alexis, for pointing that resource from the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, of course. But yeah, so that I recommend that adaptation workbook if you haven't seen it already to help you navigate through specific projects, because it's not a generic theoretical resource. It's something that you can come in with a project and follow through and actually come up with a management plan.
Thank you.
Hopefully that helps.
Thank you. I think we'll take one last question. Rob's here. Hi, Rob.
Hey, everybody. Quick question. Did you see any underplanted species that were selected for cultural purposes, or was it primarily for ecosystem services purposes?
Right. And I think that depended a lot on who was managing these. I didn't get time to dive into the Native Nations portion and component of this work in this presentation, but in the paper, there's a little bit of that component. So for Native Nations, for example, they, apart from like the ecosystem function, what species would do well, they also have that cultural factor there, because like ash for them is a culturally important species and they don't really want to lose it. So apart from just trying different species, because some tribes are actually trying different species, some of them are trying to like find like different ways that they can preserve the ash for their cultural activities or the cultural importance, either by selecting like the more adapted genotypes or like the specific genotypes, like let's say from Michigan that survive and they can plant it elsewhere, or they also doing like chemical treatments to try and preserve the ash component as well. So it depends on the objectives and the institution and the priorities too, but of course for the Native Nations, a different world, since it's a more inclusive and more, it just incorporates more aspects to the decision there as well. So there was some aspect from the cultural side that I saw on Native Nations projects. Hopefully that helps answer the question.
All right. Thanks, Sarah, for popping that up on screen. Lucia, thank you so much for a great presentation. Thank you to everybody who shared great questions. And thank you for spending your Monday afternoon with us. We're going to be back next month on November 24th with a presentation by Allie Scott, who is the Tribal Resilience Liaison with the Midwest CASC. She's going to be talking about species range shifts. Until then, we hope to stay in touch with you all via our newsletter. And if before you hop off, you can fill out this brief poll, we would really appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
All right. Enjoy the rest of your days.